All right. Good noon, everybody, and welcome back to God Was Here, our study of the life of Christ as recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, I know I made such a big deal about us being on Thursdays now, and it is, of course, Wednesday, but we had a pretty sizable break from before, and I really didn't want it to last any longer, and I just can't do it tomorrow. So you'll have to forgive me. We're broadcasting live on Wednesday today. And of course, if you want to see the broadcast on Thursday, well, we have these recorded. In fact, you can go over to my YouTube, and the link is always in the titles of these on Facebook. If you want to see the recorded broadcast, you can see it there as well. Last time we dealt with the end of the second round of teachings of Christ. Typically speaking, we see this pattern in the synoptic gospels of round of teachings, round of miracles / actions of Christ. We are now into what is going to be the third and final round of miracles / actions of Christ before we get to the final week of his life. But before we do that, there's just a little bit of cleanup I want to do that we didn't quite cover, and I realized that we needed to as far as the teachings go. You remember we dealt with the Luke 12 sermon. Well, there's a little thing that happens after Luke 12 that doesn't really fit cleanly anywhere else. So we're going to read the first few verses of Luke chapter 13. Beginning in verse 1, the Bible reads, "There were some present at that very time who had told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And he answered them, 'Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered in this way? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Or those 18 on whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them. Do you think they were worse offenders than all those who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish.'" I actually referenced this fairly recently in a little article I did in response to some people who thought that all preachers should be talking about Charlie Kirk after he died. And I pointed out that it's a very rare thing you see in the Bible that preachers are preaching on current events. I'm not saying you can't ever mention current events in a sermon. I'm just saying if you're going to be preaching very strictly after the biblical pattern, this is the only time I can think of in which somebody does that. And the point that Jesus makes, I think if we tried to make the exact same point, which is, unless you repent, you shall likewise perish, I think those people might get a little bit upset at it. Again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with somebody choosing to mention that in a sermon or anything like that. I'm just defending the choice not to do it. You never really have to do something like that. Anyway, the point Jesus is making here is trying to realign what they're thinking. Just like today, people are very concerned with their politics and whatever the current events happen to be. This is also, I believe, the first time we get introduced to the character of Pilate, who is going to be very important later on in the story. But apparently he's pretty unpopular with the Jews, and you can see some of the underlying tensions that are going on between the Jews and the Romans at this time. It says that he mingled their blood with their sacrifices. This is apparently referencing some event in which Pilate, probably during a riot or something like that. It wouldn't have been totally unprovoked, but as a method of trying to quell rebellion among the Jews, he killed people within the temple. And it wouldn't be so much the issue that he killed rebels, but it would seem that these were probably not necessarily even rebels, just people who happened to be Jews as well. And of course, the fact that they were in the temple at the time made it all the more heinous in the Jewish mind, probably in the Roman mind too, honestly. You know, there's a concept that you see in the ancient world that you're supposed to have some amount of safety. I say the ancient world, it was going on until the Middle Ages, that you're supposed to have some amount of safety when you're inside a house of worship. Even the Romans with their pagan gods, it was considered a pretty evil thing to kill somebody within their temples. The Jews had similar concepts. We see that, who was it? Abner, I believe. No, Joab. In the Old Testament, the main general, if you will, of David was named Joab. He committed a couple of atrocities during his time, and probably most notably for David is that he ignored David's command to bring back his rebellious son Absalom alive, and instead killed him. Joab actually makes a pretty good case that that was probably the right thing to do. Nevertheless, David never really forgave him for that, and so one of the things that he charges Solomon to do before David's death is you don't let Joab live. And when Joab realizes that David's dead and Solomon is after him, he attempts to go back into the temple. Not to the temple at that time, the tabernacle, and it said that he grabbed the horns of the altar, and that was sort of a concept of sanctuary. You know, as I think about it, I'm starting to think maybe Abner did something similar. Anyway, it didn't work. Joab still got killed. But it does show that people had some sort of concept of the idea of this is a place where you're supposed to have sanctuary. And even today, we sort of think similarly to that. You know, it's in Western films. How do you know the bad guy is really, 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 really bad? Well, he burns down the church building with everybody in it. Why did they all go to the church building? Because that's where it was supposed to be safe. So this is a concept that we have even now, and this is why it was probably especially heinous for the Jews at that time. I just realized my phrasing here makes me sound like I'm giving an introduction to Law and Order. But it was especially heinous. And so the Jews would have been very upset with that. So why are they trying to get Jesus to comment on that? They're trying to get him to condemn Pilate. Now, I don't know if this is a group who's trying to trap Jesus with the Romans, as was often the case people would do. But whatever the case was, Jesus doesn't really seem all that concerned about that. I told you at the beginning of this, one of the things that people desperately want Jesus to be today is something political. But when you actually look at the life of Christ, he was radically apolitical. I'm not going to say he didn't care. Jesus loved everybody, so it's not that he didn't care that people died. But his focus was entirely spiritual, and every single time people tried to bring him into the politics of the day, he would essentially ignore the question and bring it back to where it ought to be, which is on the spiritual, which is what he's doing here. He takes the opportunity to teach a lesson that death comes for everybody. He is completely denying the idea that these are bad things that happened to bad people, and that the good things happen to good people. Again, there are people today who will preach exactly that, and they are completely off. They have missed the point of the Bible. They've missed the point of the book of Job, for example. The whole point of Job is that bad things happen to good people. But our focus should not be on the physical world, in which bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. Our focus ought to be on the spiritual realm, in which we will spend eternity, and the concerns of today will seem as nothing. And I'm sure some of you have had terrible things happen to you, and I just don't understand how these things will seem as nothing. But we got to trust God. Then when he says it will seem as nothing, it will seem as nothing. Therefore, we ought to focus on the spiritual. So that's the point Jesus makes up after this comment that he receives after the Luke 12 sermon. Now, with the remainder of our time, let's start talking about some more miracles, actions of Jesus. For this next one, I want to go to Matthew chapter 15. This is the feeding of the 4,000. I believe Mark actually has this happening before Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. Again, sometimes this gets a little messy. This is where I've chosen to put it afterwards, but you know, it's totally fine to have it before then. But Matthew 15 is where we're looking at. And then if you want to see the parallel, that would be in Mark chapter 8, verses 1 to 10. But we're looking at Matthew chapter 15. It says in verse 32, "Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. And the disciples said to him, Where are we going to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd?" And Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" They said, "7, and a few small fish." And directing the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowd, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 7 baskets full of the broken pieces of leftovers. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, he got on a boat and went to the region of Magadan. Okay. This ought to sound very familiar. This doesn't indicate that there's any sort of problem with the scriptures. We've seen other places in which Jesus would do similar miracles on different occasions, and this is no different. Jesus is using a similar miracle, that is the feeding of the more famous feeding of the 5,000 in a very similar situation. Although I will note that it appears the crowd is a little bit less hostile than we see on that occasion. And when I mean hostile, I don't mean necessarily hostile to Jesus himself, but rather to his message. The message of Christ was always an unpopular one. And it seems that the crowd in the 5,000, they were more interested in the miracles. There doesn't seem to be any indication of that going on with the 4,000. He sends them away and they're ready to go. That didn't happen with the 5,000. They were trying to make him king. But we don't really talk about this one so much. One, just because it doesn't seem like there's as much to talk about. And two, it's weird to say, but it's a less impressive miracle. Now, it's just as impossible as feeding 5,000, but I don't know. You have a little more fish, a little more bread, a little less people, and a little less leftovers. And for some reason, it just doesn't register as quite as extreme. But make no mistake, this is obviously an extreme miracle as well. Let's look to another occasion. 2 more miracles here, and as far as I can tell, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I couldn't find these occasions, though, in either Matthew or Luke's account, so it might just be Mark that has these. But we have 2 more healings here. Let's start in Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 31. And the Bible reads, "And he returned from the region of Tyre, and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis." So, again, Jesus is back over at the Decapolis. This is not the first time we've seen him go over there. "And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hands on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue, and looked up to the heavens, and sighed, and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be open. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged him to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Okay. A couple of things that are interesting about this. This is one of these probably lesser discussed miracles of Christ. I don't remember a whole lot of Bible classes growing up where we talked about this particular miracle, but it's an interesting one. He's over in the Decapolis, that's Gentile country. They bring this man who is mute and deaf. So, kind of a double problem over there. I suppose if you've been deaf from birth, you probably don't have much chance at being able to speak, or at least speak well, but he can't speak either. So Jesus prays, and he does a sort of a strange thing. Of course, we know Jesus doesn't have to do any sort of movements. There's no incantations or anything like that that are necessary in order for Jesus's miracles to work. But he does it here. And he says, he kind of looks to heaven, says, be opened, and he puts his fingers into the ears of this deaf man. And then, and the phrasing here is a little ambiguous, but I believe what the Bible is trying to say here is that after this, he spit on his hand and touched the tongue of this man. This is reminiscent of another miracle that would happen later by the pool of Bethesda, in which Jesus would spit on the ground, create mud, and put that on a blind man's eyes, and he'd be able to see. We'll talk about that later. But this is something similar. And why does he go to all of this business instead of just saying, sure, be healed? Now, we've made the case before that there's been a couple of times where it's been pretty powerful. The fact, for example, that he would touch lepers in order to heal them. I mean, that's powerful. There's a lot being said in that touch. You haven't been touched by anybody in years, yet I'm going to touch you. That is showing love. Why he goes to all this trouble to heal him instead of just going, be healed, I got no idea. But it certainly would have made an impression. And we see something that we've also seen several times, which is that he charges everybody not to tell anybody about what's being seen. And of course, they do the exact opposite of that. It makes you wonder why he's even bothering to tell people not to tell anybody anymore, because they always do. I don't know. Maybe that's to show something to us about how even when miracles happen to people, we tend to be disobedient. And I'm not pointing fingers particularly at the deaf man here, because it says he charged them, and they're not really, Mark isn't that specific about who them is. I think it's talking about the general crowd who was around. But maybe that's to show us that just seeing a miracle does not create obedience. That's another very important point we're going to see later in the life of Christ. Another miracle I want to talk about, again in Mark chapter 8. In verse 22, the Bible reads, "And they came to Bethsaida." I mentioned earlier that there was a blind man by the pool of Bethesda. This is not the same thing. This is Bethsaida. "And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid hands on him, he said to him, 'Do you see anything?' And he looked up and said, 'I see people, but they look like trees walking.' Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent to his home, saying, 'Do not even enter the village.'" Okay. So, a couple of interesting things. But again, it's very easy to get this confused with the pool of Bethesda. This is not a pool in Jerusalem like Bethesda is. This is the village of Bethsaida where this blind man lived. And again, there's some similarities here, but it's not quite the same thing. So try not to get him confused. They bring to him a blind man, ask him to heal him. And perhaps, I just asked the question, why does he even bother telling people not to tell anybody anymore? So maybe his actions here are to try to encourage people to not just come to him for the miracles. He leads the blind man out of the village, and it says that he spits into his eye. This is, again, he's not spitting on the ground and making mud and then using that. No, it just spits right into his eyes. And he says, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they are like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His eyesight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. We know pretty reasonably one thing about this guy, which is that he was not born blind. There are times where the Bible will specifically tell us that somebody was born blind, born deaf, born lame, whatever, but this guy was not. How do I know that? It's because the first time when Jesus moves his hand away, he spat in his eyes and put his hands on him, and he takes him away, and he asks, "Do you see?" And he says, "I can kind of see. I see people around, I think, back over there, but they look like trees walking." Well, here's my question. If he was born blind, how on earth would he know what a tree looks like? He wasn't. So he probably wasn't born blind. I don't know how he was blinded. So then Jesus puts his hand over his eyes again, removes it, and now he can see perfectly. 20/20 vision. Now, this can be a little inconvenient sometimes, because sometimes we like to say when you look at the miracles of Christ or people in the Bible who are miracle workers, they have one thing in common, which is far different than miracle workers of today, which is often you might see somebody who is claiming to work miracles, and then you'll have somebody maybe come to them and they got a cane and they're walking along like that, and then they get healed, which apparently looks like being palmed right in the forehead and then falling over. And then, yay, they're all healed. And then they just sort of hobble on out. So I guess you're just a tiny little bit better than you were before. And often we say, well, look at how they heal in the Bible. They heal completely. Well, there's actually an exception to that rule that happens right here. Now, I will say this. Ultimately, what happens is full healing, and so it's not really an exception. You can continue to say that if you'd like. Why on earth Jesus healed in this matter here, I got no idea whatsoever. I have no idea why. 'Cause it's not as if Jesus lacked the power to be able to heal him all at once. I really don't know. If anybody has an idea, please leave it in the comments, because I am just... I've mentioned that the life of Christ is, in my opinion, the hardest thing to really understand in the Bible. And this is one of those things that I'm talking about. Why on earth did he not just actually heal him in one go? I've got no idea, but I'd be curious to see if you did. All right. I did have one more thing I wanted to go over, but we're at about 25 minutes now. Yeah, we'll save it for next week. We're going to be talking about the Transfiguration next week, among other things. It will, Lord willing, be on Thursday at that point. But until I see you then, I love you all, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Bye.